Welcome to the China MENA podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Fulton, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a political scientist at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. As China's interests and influence in the Middle East grow, there has been a lot of analysis of China's regional foreign policy that assumes that the PRC is well positioned to be the next great extra-regional power. Looking at the arc of trade, investment, contracting, and tech transfers over the past 15 to 20 years shows us that the Middle East matters to Beijing a lot more than it did at the turn of the century. At the same time, these reports of China-MENA relations rarely get into the domestic factors that are influencing Chinese decision makers. Any reasonable analysis of a country's foreign policy has to look inside as well to get a sense of the domestic, political, and economic pressures from within. To help us get a better sense of the relationship between China's domestic politics and its foreign policy, I'm happy to be joined by Kerry Brown, who, among many other affiliations, is professor of Chinese Studies and director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. From 1998 to 2005, he worked at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office with a posting as First Secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing. He has published an incredible output of books and journal articles on modern Chinese politics and history, getting close to occupying an entire shelf of my bookcase at this point. Kerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So look, just to set the stage, there's been a lot less information coming out of China over the past few years than what we were used to before COVID. We're not getting the same kind of economic data. We're not getting the same kind of journalism out of China. So people are working often on assumptions or just kind of Chinese whispers sometimes. So what do you see are as the political and economic pressures that are driving decisions in Beijing these days?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. You're right. I mean, I think in my 30 years of dealing with China, I can't remember a period when it's been so difficult to get access. Part of that because of the pandemic and the fact that there's just not been the same kind of physical contact between the outside world and China, although that's picking up a bit. And part of it because of difficult relations with America in particular. There was expulsion of journalists tit for tat about 3 years ago, and that's had a big impact. I mean, some very fine journalists who were, getting access in China just aren't operating now. So it's really difficult to see what's happening. What we can see, though, is signs which are not very reassuring. Firstly, some really kind of capricious signs over personnel decisions, the removal of a foreign minister after only being in office a few months, the removal of a minister of defense last year, Li Xiangfu, after I think literally a few weeks as the Minister of Defence. The end of last year, removal of a number of PLA people in the rocket force area. Again, these are sort of, they're not individually such a big deal, I guess, but they're not reassuring. They're kind of a sign of a highly deliberative system that doesn't seem to be particularly deliberative at the moment. And we have to remember that these are appointments made when, in theory at least, Xi Jinping is all dominant. I think what we can see is a political environment which is dominated by some serious economic issues. And these are around issues of sustaining good growth, about youth unemployment, which is apparently about 20%, perpetual issues with the housing market, which have been there a long time, but they seem to sort of get more and more worrying. And then issues of whether the government has a real game plan for how it's going to develop its economy going forward. And then looming over this, I say the final thing is a sort of question mark over Xi Jinping. He has been sort of erratic in some ways, at present, for instance, at the BRICS summit, but not really speaking. Not present at the G20. He sent his Premier Li Qiang. Li Qiang was also sent to Davos only last week. Kind of seems that the Premier is doing a lot of the stuff that once the President did. And that might mean not a great deal, or it might mean that there's issues. It's going to have to be quite soon that there's some idea of who may well one day replace Xi Jinping. I mean, he can't continue forever. And the idea of this huge system having, such reliance on one leader when
Yeah.
that leader is maybe not functioning at 100%, particularly in view of what might be happening in America later this year and what might be happening in the rest of the world with 40 elections in 2024. This is going to be a very, very tough year. You need someone at the peak of their powers and performance, and it's not entirely clear that Xi Jinping is. So I find it a little bit, quite concerning at the moment.
Yeah, one thing I see is a lot more people from China are going out, to use a well-used phrase, and looking for a lot of investment. We see a lot of people looking for investment into real estate primarily, but other sectors as well. And I think what you're speaking of, when a system is so dominated by a single personality, and we just don't know, like the information we're getting isn't good. There's been so many rumors of health issues, and and it could just be rumors, but the fact that we don't have complete information is I think pretty worrying. I think, you gave us a really good overview. I mean, with the high youth unemployment and the slow economic growth and all of these things are a big story. How do you think this stuff shapes China's foreign policy agenda?
Well, it's clear that the pandemic has had a kind of systematic impact on China's relations with the world. It's created a sort of two zone world where I think those that were benign or more kind of transactional minded, they're able to create relations with China as ever. I mean, the Middle East, where you're based, I mean, Saudi Arabia seems to be able to work with China, although maybe there's some questions over whether they should, but they seem to. Russia obviously is now continuing to be close to China. On the other hand, there's increased antipathy by America, Europe, and others towards the idea of a world which is too dominated by China. Lots of pushback. And I think the stresses on the Chinese foreign policy now are quite serious. Two examples, I guess, which really show that. One is, of course, the Ukrainian issue, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where China has kind of not left the side of Russia. It's shown loyalty. However, it's been difficult. I think it's not really totally in China's interest to have this huge kind of drain on geopolitical attention and also the economy with Russia and Ukraine. And on the other hand, the Middle East, the Israeli action in Gaza. I mean, China has offered a kind of peace proposal or a two-state solution support. It's one of the very few powers that has relations with all the parties. I mean, it's able to work with the Palestinian organization. It's able to work with the Israelis. But I think it's not able to say anything except kind of empty platitudes in a way. I mean, this is a great power with a huge economic clout now, and yet it seems to be very unwilling to kind of step forward. I suppose that to me sort of shows this narrative of China being the dominant new, hegemon. Well, I mean, it's had two big opportunities to really, really go in and dominate because no one else seems to know what to do, and it's not really done anything. And I suspect going forward, our problem geopolitically will be not a China which is very, very forceful and coming to the fore and basically, stepping up and kind of giving it to us. It's going to be a China that just does not want to get involved, no matter even if it should get involved. A passive China rather than an active China. And I think that we're starting to really see that. A China which is inactive rather than overactive, which is not the problem that most people tend to attribute to China at the moment, particularly in America and Europe.
That's a great point because I've had a lot of conversations this week and last week. Everybody wants to talk about the Red Sea, the Houthi attack on shipping. And one thing that keeps coming up is folks will say, look, China's got this military installation in Djibouti. They've got naval vessels in the Red Sea. China is, of course, a very important maritime shipping country, relying so much on maritime trade. Why aren't they doing anything? And I think a lot of governments in the region expected a more robust response from China to this. But what you've seen is China seeming to be very reluctant to get involved and kind of free riding to say, okay, we're going to criticize the U.S. for its support to Israel. At the same time, we're going to let America do the heavy lifting on this crucial issue that's very important to us. And I think a lot of people in the region are looking at it and going a little taking them off guard, saying, well, we thought you were the next great power. Why are you acting, why are you free riding? Why aren't you doing more? So there is a pretty big gap between the perception and the reality right now. Do you think that's because in Beijing there's just a lack of a sense that this is important to play a bigger role, or is it that they don't see themselves in those terms, that they don't see themselves as a global power that has those kind of responsibilities, that they're happy to just be kind of a trading power and leave it at that? Because the narrative has been a lot about, Chinese alternatives, right? We've got the global security, the global development initiatives. We're a new type of great power, and we're just not seeing any meat on the bone yet. So what do you think accounts for that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jonathan. I mean, I think we have to think a lot about the very surprising things that have been happening in the United States in the last half a decade, and which are happening, as we speak now.
Yeah.
I think for China in particular, its worldview was the United States was going to be the dominant, kind of power for the foreseeable future, and there was problems for that for China, but it assumed that this was going to be the geopolitics that it would have to work around. And I think the way in which, particularly the Trump presidency, the first one, kind of questioned the commitment of America to, a global leadership role, and may well, kind of come back to that if Trump is re-elected later this year, I think has completely thrown China. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense why China has gone into this huddle and is so defensive, because in fact it kind of needed to play off the American security blanket, the fact that it didn't like it, but it was very predictable. It knew what it was dealing with. And now it's in this position of a world of really great uncertainty. It doesn't really know what it's going to be dealing with from, November. It may be more of the same if Biden is re-elected. If Biden does stand, it may mean if Trump stands that you're going to have real chaos. And I think that China, more than any other power, is completely unsettled by this. Because, of course, as the world's second biggest economy, it's kind of meant to step in some areas where America is just not going to be functioning, maybe, or not want to function. If you look at the core issue that matters to China, its own region, the South and East China Sea, and of course Taiwan, in a sense, the Trump presidency is going to be, if it happens, an opportunity, because, I don't think that Trump looks like he's going to stand by Taiwan. I mean, that's possible. That's absolutely possible. On the other hand, I've looked at all of the scenarios about what could happen with Taiwan. None of them are easily manageable for China if it makes a proactive move. They're all pretty scary. They're all going to be really, really tough. And as you know, the Taiwanese election earlier this month, January, saw the election of DPP Lai Ching-te, who is, strong supporter of sovereignty. This is not going to be an easy thing for China to deal with. So I think that this has really the way in which America is not acting in the way that China, I think, expected is deeply unsettling to it. It sounds strange, really, because you think that, an America which was willing to kind of disappear a bit and, kind of withdraw would be good for China. But I don't think it is. I think it's really thrown them.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, if you look back to all the leadership statements pre-Trump, the BRI is meant to be complementary. It's supposed to buttress the existing order to address its, structural weaknesses. And then you see after Trump, there's this kind of assumption that the West is fractured, that NATO doesn't count. And you see all these more ambitious statements saying, the Global Development Initiative, we have a different approach, and we're a new type of great power with a new idea about how things are supposed to work. But But I think things changed so quickly, from Trump to Biden again, where again the West looked more coherent than it did, and these alignments or alliances had more to them than what China had seen over the previous 4 years. And I think it really put them on their back foot. So I think you're right. Like another Trump presidency is going to really, reshuffle the deck for them in a way that I imagine is very unsettling. Going back to the internal stuff in China, I mean, I just recently went to the Kerry Brown shelf in the bookcase, and I saw your book from 2017, China's World, which is really, really great. And there was a line that that struck me. You wrote, "China has a middle class that is anything from 300 to 500 million strong. The party state has to keep this demanding, highly expectant group of people happy, and therefore only interested in the outside world in ways that assist this." And I've thought about that. I thought that's a really good distillation of something that I've been trying to say to people for quite a while around here, that, for the party, which is so consumed with environmental issues and wealth distribution issues and rural and urban divide and finding jobs for young people and creating a sustainable economy and all this stuff, I mean, that has to consume something like 85 to 90% of their bandwidth. And I keep looking at their relationships with other countries that you mentioned core earlier, and we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes, but those countries that are kind of outside of its immediate periphery, I think their significance lies in how they can help support China in this domestic stuff. So just looking at this sentence of yours from the book, can you kind of unpack this a bit? Like, why do you see the CCP as less interested with international affairs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the middle class you just referred to, and kind of their role. One of the weird things about the Chinese government, I mean, people often think it's completely heedless of public opinion. I mean, it doesn't really have any evidence of public opinion. There's no election, so it's like it's all repressed. To me, I read a description from 180 years ago, actually, which I thought still applied. A British person, I think, in China in the 1830s, who said the thing about the Chinese government then was it was obsessed by public opinion about every little thing. And all these officials would just be listening terrified, and the slightest kind of sign of problems, they would, try and be managing it. And, they would sort of just be managing and firefighting all the time. It was in a perpetual kind of crisis. And I don't think that's really changed. I mean, social media and other things have given the Chinese government, a lot of access to what Chinese people think. And it's always responding in a way. It's always doing stuff and responding. And we saw maybe during the kind of end of 2022, when there were the protests against, zero COVID and lockdowns, the Chinese government kind of literally chucked all its regulations out of the window within a matter of days. So it does respond. I mean, I think on, this question of international relations and whether does this matter to the Chinese middle class. I think so. Firstly, I think China's status matters to the middle class. They want their country to kind of look respected and good. And in a weird way, Xi Jinping is kind of good at that because, he obviously has status. He does terrify people, and that's not a bad thing for, the Chinese to look at their leader being so impactful. I think the second thing is the Chinese middle class clearly want to have connections for education and investment with the wider world. Non-state companies still want to come out and do stuff. You said earlier about how there are more Chinese kind of coming out of China now, after the pandemic and, looking at opportunities. So they do want to have a sort of global role. And I think finally, I think that there is obviously this sort of trend lately of some wealthier Chinese looking to just get out of the country. I mean, this has been happening, I think, in Canada, and I mean also up to an extent in America. It's a kind of strange situation where you've got a very nationalistic environment where people are very patriotic, and yet you've got a lot of people voting with their feet. It's hard to assess this because People are always looking for new opportunities. People are migrating left, right, and centre. So, I don't know whether it's kind of very deep and meaningful, but I think it shows that public opinion in China is not something you can ever make big assumptions about. People can say it's nationalistic. Well, maybe it is, but I mean, maybe it's also extremely critical of its government. And I think that's not just true of the outside world. I think the Chinese government is also not 100% sure what its people are thinking. And I think that this, is a kind of factor we're going to have to watch this year, because if the economy is tough and it may go into poor growth or even negative growth, it's possible. This is a China that we haven't seen for a long, long time, a China which is ailing economically. We haven't seen that. And politically, I can't predict what that place will look like, but I don't think it's going to be an easy one for the government.
Yeah, I'm sure you saw it, but Evan Osnos wrote a really good article for the New Yorker. I think about 2 months ago. He went back to Beijing after being gone for quite a while and talked to a lot of his friends. And I think he left China at the start of the Xi Jinping era and went back to the States. And, he came back, and that was one of the things everybody was saying was a lot of people are looking for ways to move their wealth out of the country, get their kids and universities out of the country, and possibly get themselves out. And I know a lot of people criticize the article for him just talking to a very small selection of Chinese people, but I think it does speak to a lot of the concerns people have that, things aren't trending in a direction that it looked like they were even 5 years ago. I remember the last time I was in China in 2019, and there was this real triumphalism, like this sense of we've seen nothing but blue skies ahead. And I haven't been there since then, but I don't think that's the case. It's funny when you're talking about protests, like the protest of zero COVID. And I remember reading about those and thinking, this is really weird. But then we're just remembering what it was like at the end of the Hu Jintao era, when these mass incidents, hundreds and hundreds of mass incidents a day. Chinese people, I think you're right. There's this sense of complacency in the way people talk about it, and not really realizing what a vibrant civil culture there is with people that have serious demands. And of course, the government has to pay attention to that, because if you aren't paying attention to those constituents, China's a long history of internal collapse, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think it's why the Xi Jinping era is a bit strange, because as you rightly said, during the Hu Jintao period, when you went to China, it wasn't unusual to see protests. I remember seeing protests outside a hospital in Shanghai. I remember going to a government office, I think the mayor's office or something, in Inner Mongolia, in Huahata, and there was a demonstration of elderly, I think, military people who hadn't got their pensions. I mean, everywhere you went, people seemed to sort of be kicking up a fuss, and it wasn't hard to find that. Whereas under Xi Jinping, it's so placid, and yet I don't think society has got less complicated. No way. I mean, I think there's still obviously big issues of, social justice, inequity, and, inequality. It seems, though, that it's been pushed under a kind of, sort of barrier, so that you just don't see it. And I guess on the elite level, what is really weird is there's no sign at the elite level of big pushback against Xi. I mean, he's had no one really oppose him as he sort of has had his ascent in the last 10 years. Not really. I mean, if you think in the Hu Jintao period, you had a brief period when Wen Jiabao was talking about democracy. In the Jiang Zemin period, you had significant opposition to him by big figures like Qiao Shi, who got kicked out of the Politburo. Mao Zedong had to deal with opposition, and that was extremely costly for those who opposed him. But there were opponents. Under Xi Jinping, it's like weird. Where are they all gone? Is it really the case that this enormously complicated country with all of the complex issues it's facing has no one with a different view? I mean, that there's no one in the elite that has maybe sort of some skepticism about Xi's approach. That's really the thing that I'm sort of wondering, where it's like the dog that didn't bark in the night. Where's the opponents? Where have they gone? Is it really the case that there's just no one who thinks that he's doing anything kind of wrong? And I wonder whether one day we will kind of think, wow, we missed that. There were really obvious signs. There were things that we saw, that the kind of weird removal of Hu Jintao at the Congress a couple of years ago. Maybe this was very significant. These things that will make sense afterwards. But as of today, I have to say, it's very hard to see any really high elite divisions. And that's very, very strange, but it's very striking.
It is strange because, you just look back, there were institutionalized factions within the party always, right? There was the Communist Youth League, there's the Shanghai clique, there's all these different, poles of power and influence within the party, and navigating that was really a really important skill, building those networks. And I don't know if it's just that he dismantled all of them, or if everybody's just quietly laying in wait. You mentioned the Hu Jintao removal, and then of course there was that article in Nikkei a couple of months ago about all the party elders that gave him a stern talking to, which I don't think too many people put a lot of stock in. But I think there's the sense, like in a place that in a party that big, with a lot of ambitious people, looking at the trend lines, there's a lot of folks who are probably thinking, this doesn't look good for us. And, there's probably a lot of space for people to say, let's present some kind of an alternative. And I think they're probably looking for the opportune moment, because you don't want to get caught with your pants down, and, it could be pretty risky, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago core interests, and I think that's something when you talked about the East China Sea, or South China Sea rather, or both, I guess. That was something that Susan Shirk in her last book brought up, and I think I hadn't seen that as listed as part of the core interests, but typically the core interests were very inward looking. Whenever China would talk about it, and the core interests were a kind of a new innovation in Chinese diplomatic talk. I think it's only been about 15 years or so that you hear people in Beijing say, these are our core interests, these are the most important things. So just for our listeners, like how did they define core interests, and what does it tell you about its approach to the broader foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of notion of a core interest came quite late. I think it was under Dai Bingguo, a state councillor in, I think, 2009, 2010. I think he was actually speaking in America when he was sort of suddenly referred to this idea of these core interests. And what was striking about them at the time was how everything was defined as serving the stability of the party state and its ability to have stable rule in China. So, there was a kind of intimate link between China's international interests and what served the security of the party state and the socialist system in China. So to come back to our earlier kind of discussion, the internal and the external, are welded together. There's no hairline between them, really. I think one of the things about the Xi Jinping era is a greater willingness to say much more on what China's interests are. I think this is part of an acknowledgement that under Hu Jintao, China was a silent superpower. It never really kind of said what it wanted, and it was pretending to be a little mouse when actually it was the size of an elephant. It kind of needed to say more. And I guess Xi Jinping, with the Belt and Road Initiative and the idea of common prosperity and these things, well, there's been sort of at least some attempt to say, what is the China world view? Inevitably, that has created lots of speculation and lots of, kind of accusations that China has a global vision that it wants to dominate. I think that personally, China is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't when it speaks about its vision. If it doesn't say anything, people are very suspicious and wonder what it's up to. And if it does say something, immediately people kind of accuse it of having, sort of megalomaniacal kind of demands. I think what I sort of feel about its core interests are that they're quite parochial. I mean, they're really about regional security, the South and East China Sea, Taiwan. These are the sort of, the core things. And I think that's understandable because China wants a zone of strategic security around it, but there's no sort of sense of it trying to kind of articulate a security doctrine for the Central Asian region. As you know better than me, in the Middle East, it doesn't really have a security doctrine. It doesn't have a security outlook for Africa. It's suddenly got more interested in Latin America, but it doesn't really have a security link, idea of that. This is the problem, I guess, that China, when it talks the language of economic benefit, it will have an audience. I think some people will follow it and be interested, of course. But when China speaks the language of security, it's a totally different ballgame. And there's far fewer who either want to understand what it's talking about or who have much sympathy with it. And I suppose the quandary for China going forward is, as it gets more of a kind of global role, it's going to have to talk about security more. And, like with the Middle East and with Ukraine, the language it's using at the moment is not really fit for purpose. I can't see it continuing to sort of do that.
Yeah, well, that sets up my next question perfectly, because I want to bring it back to the Middle East. And, there's a lot you were saying that really got me thinking about it. I mean, one of the things I keep hearing when I talk to folks from the U.S., there's often this sense of China kind of marching forward and claiming its space in the world. And I keep trying to remind folks who don't think about China, kind of at a more granular level, it's in a really tough neighborhood. I mean, so the domestic stuff's really important, and a lot of folks don't think about that. But then when you get beyond that, then you've got to deal with all the countries it shares borders with. And a lot of them are unstable, and a lot of them are hostile towards China, and some of them are U.S. allies or partners. And they're in a really, really tough neighborhood. And meanwhile, the U.S. is, pretty much blessed by geography. They don't really face any serious threats from a neighbor. It doesn't have to worry about its own region in the same way China does. So I think Chinese leaders are intensely focused on that more than anything. And when we bring that to the Middle East, and you say the language about security isn't really sufficient, I mean, the thing we keep hearing is peace through development, right? That look at how China's gone from a weak, underdeveloped country with a lot of security threats, and it's become a very prosperous and stable country. And that was by largely economic issues, or economic solutions. And you keep hearing that when they talk about the Middle East. If you address the underdevelopment, you address you take away the attraction of non-state actors or political terrorists or whatever. And that's been the prescription for what, when China talks to Middle East leaders about security, they say, we're going to help you with development. And of course, in a region that is desperate for FDI and desperate for development and desperate for more trade, then great, that sounds wonderful. But then you see this Hamas attack on Israel, and you realize that just doesn't solve the problem. You need more than just peace through development. You actually need more to it. And I think China's pretty ill-equipped for that right now. So I think the war in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East has really shown us just how they don't really have the solution that people need right now.
I mean, the meeting we met at in Doha last year was a bit of a revelation to me, because I could feel that a lot of the audience from different Middle Eastern countries that were present, they have a solid interest in China. I mean, they obviously regard it as a big opportunity, and maybe too much of an opportunity. I mean, I think I really wonder whether they're not going to be a bit disappointed with what China's going to deliver in the end. But I also could see that culturally, I think that there's nothing but difference. I mean, this is the problem. It's like, I don't think China is economically or militarily as big an issue for Europe and America as is culturally. I mean, it's a massive cultural challenge. And for the Middle East, I think that's, even more so. I don't think you were present. One of the discussions in the meeting, a colleague from China was asked about, the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang. And I mean, her comment was something about the Muslim minority in China are, I think her words were, troublesome. And I mean, it seemed to me to show an extraordinary kind of cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, that there was this very bland language of, oh, we're going to cooperate and it'll all be fine. But on the other hand, there's also a sort of very, very big cultural kind of dissimilarity. Um, I mean, I think the problem for China is obviously it's got to deal with this region because it needs things from it. I mean, it definitely needs things from it. We all know what it needs. I mean, particularly energy, but other raw materials. And it's also interested in the fact that this is a wealthy region now. I mean, it's got wealthy countries there. But I think it's diplomacy, and certainly it's an attempt to kind of have soft power, um, is really, really hard to imagine how it's going to develop that. I mean, um, it's put a lot of effort into understanding America and Europe. I mean, I think I'll give China credit. It has tried to, but I think China has not done a huge amount on trying to understand, for instance, the Middle East. I don't think it tries to understand India at all. It doesn't really try and understand, Africa and Latin America. I mean, it's very sort of patchy. And so you really have to wonder, okay, there's this power with very different values, very different culture, looking for a global role. And there's space for it to have that global role. It's opening up. But it doesn't really have the message to get people on side. No one's really kind of rooting for it. I think even those that transactionally work with China, they're doing it, on the basis of utility basically, or use, but they're not really on the side of China. I mean, American values did get a lot of people supportive and believing in them and thinking they applied to them and that they were transferable. But Chinese values are very culturally circumscribed. So this is going to be a very different world where China is more dominant because there's not going to be a kind of shared, sort of idea of cultural kind of commonality. It's going to be a world where, it's transactional and we just sort of get on and do what we can, but there's not going to be much idealism. And so that's going to be quite a harsh and stark world, I think.
Yeah, to the soft power bit, I mean, I've just sent a paper off to an article on China's soft power projection in the Middle East. And it's really interesting because I think there's a tremendous gap. I think, you hear a lot of people talking about China as they respect our sovereignty and they do things differently. And there's this sense that China is going to be really valuable. But I think a lot of people are just projecting what they want on China because it's really a blank page for a lot of folks in the region. They don't know much about it. There's no area studies here where people are learning about Chinese history and culture and society, and the language is starting to come into the national curriculums, but this is going to take a long time to have an impact. Like China is a big question mark. And the headlines, I mean, at that workshop you referred to, or the meeting, we heard a lot of people throwing out these big numbers that keep showing up in headlines. China's investing $11 billion in Oman and giving $400 billion to Iran. And this stuff's all been debunked, but it was in a headline once and people have just kind of absorbed that. And that's what they know about China. They come in and they address our problems and they give us a lot. But if you ask the follow-up question, like what can you tell us about China's strategic culture, China's history, China's involvement in the region, China's Uyghur situation, you don't really get a lot of depth. So it does have a hard time. In terms of the soft power, I remember moving here. I lived in South Korea before I came to the UAE, and I was really surprised to learn that my time in Korea would be so valuable here because my students were obsessed with it. They love Korean pop music and its dramas and all this stuff. They love manga and anime from Japan. They love the Bollywood movies from India. They love the dramas from Turkey. China's got almost no impact on those cultural products, and people just aren't really consuming stuff about China. The food, the pop culture, the hip hop songs about Xi Jinping, or the Belt and Road initiative, that doesn't translate outside of Marxist-Leninist. I think that's a problem they have. A lot of their cultural products are designed for a very specific domestic audience, and it just doesn't travel very well. And here it seems, kind of incomprehensible for folks.
Yes, I mean, I think they're very envious of South Korea and the, enormous impact that their television, their films, I mean, their general kind of image. People really like South Korean food. They like the products. They like their cultural products. Particularly their films. And I guess China is the great kind of potential has never really been fulfilled culturally. I suppose that when you look at Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, as some people call it now, that's a festival of, I suppose, partly of Chinese culture. And everywhere you go in Europe, London, Sydney, San Francisco, there's these big festivals. In a sense, that shows you what kind of reach Chinese culture broadly can have. I mean, people are interested and attracted by it, by the cuisine, by the, kind of the kung fu, by all of this sort of paraphernalia. And yet, the image of China as a country, because of its political system, continues to be challenging and confronting. I mean, this is, something that I find strange that, people say that China is trying to influence and, change public opinion and have an impact. I mean, I think the problem is not that it's trying to influence public opinion in covert ways. I think the thing is that it's really not able to. I mean, even when it's got a case to make. I mean, I think there's sometimes, believe it or not, China's got a reason for believing and doing the things it wants to do. And when it makes this case, of course, almost every time it gets a very rough reception in the kind of outside world, particularly in the media. And I kind of feel that that's as much a problem as, the fact that within its own domestic media, it's always so positive and everything's great. Within, a lot of foreign media about China, everything is always so terrible. I mean, there's no balance. And so it's been very frustrating in the last 3 or 4 years to kind of try and see, okay, where can you get a kind of more neutral view of China, which is, admitting that there are big problems, but also that it's not this bastion of evil that I think, sometimes it's made out to be. It's, it's problematic, but I don't think it's existentially evil. But it's very difficult to get that kind of balance in a lot of Western discourse. And I think it's not helped by the fact that, in some areas like in the Middle East, China is accepted sometimes on its own terms, at least publicly. And yet, I mean, there's clearly very big reservations about what China means for people. I mean, culturally and in terms of its politics, I think in the Middle East, there are certainly people who must have big reservations about what China is doing to its Muslims, for instance. I mean, it must be a very big problem, but it's not spoken about. I think that's just, kind of going to be more and more difficult as we go forward to get an accurate understanding of what China is, because it's either way too positive or way too negative, and neither are particularly truthful.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. When I think about China's presence here, it can be a tremendously important actor, in what it can offer technologically and economically. This is really needed in the region. They need countries that have that kind of experience that can do it. And it's gotten to the point where it's hard to imagine that working out very easily, because there's really is kind of this, I don't know, like a bifurcation, it seems that, you've got to pick. And I've said this so many times, if you look just neutrally at what, say, the West writ large, what the West's interests in the Middle East are and what China's interests in the Middle East are, they line up really neatly. And you can see a situation where in a different political environment, there could be some kind of coordination on policy to really help the region quite a lot, rather than looking at it as its own competition. And so hopefully, things politically change. Although, as you said earlier on in the show, with all these elections coming up this year, there's a chance that folks are going to use politics to do all sorts of, address all sorts of their own domestic issues, and maybe not help out on things in the foreign policy front too much.
Indeed, it's going to be quite a year. It's going to be quite a year. We're going to have to hold on by the seat of our pants, I think. It's, yeah.
Yep. We're 24 days in. It already feels like it's been a year.
Indeed.
Well, look, Kerry, I can't thank you enough. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our listeners will too. It's really useful. Just, what are you working on now? Would you have a book on its way?
Well, I have two actually. One on history of Britain's relations with China from 1570, which is going to come out with Yale in August. It's never been written before, a comprehensive history of Britain's relations with China. And so I just wanted to give British people their China story, basically, because the Chinese know their story about us, but we don't know it back. And I enjoyed writing that a lot. And then a more kind of polemical book about Taiwan for Penguin, just about, scenarios, what might happen. And my conclusion is the less that happens, the better. This is an insoluble problem. It's like a kind of ticking time bomb. And I just was quite surprised at some American politicians wading in and saying we should recognize Taiwan. I don't think these people know what they're dealing with. Mike Pompeo, for instance, went to Taiwan and said, we need to have an embassy in Taipei. Well, okay, but you've got to get ready to bring the body bags back, because this is going to be inflammatory. So I just hope that this kind of contributes to maybe calming things down a bit and keeping people away from trying to be too adventurous on this issue, because it's not soluble at the moment.
No, I can't wait to read that. Right out of university, my thought was I was an African politics guy in my bachelor's degree, and I thought I was going to do that. And then I went to Taiwan to teach English as a 22-year-old, and that was it. And fell in love with the place and can't wait to read this book. Look, thanks so much for joining us. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. This is really, really helpful. To our listeners, thanks for joining us. We're going to have another really great show in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned. And of course, like and rate and subscribe and tell all your friends and all that other good podcast stuff. And we'll see you all very soon.